What are the big issues that are coming out of conversations here at MIPIM today?
Well, I think there's an overarching issue, which is how do you reconcile necessary development, and in the case of housing, development in huge quantities, with the natural reluctance of ordinary people and ordinary communities to contemplate having construction taking place on their doorstep for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. That is, of course, what the planning system is there to sort out. But I think it is an underlying dilemma about how politicians persuade people that development is good for them. And that's really a political task. It can't just be the task for developers or indeed planners themselves.
And are we seeing any examples of where that new forms of construction are being brought to London? Things like the factory-made housing, off-site manufacturing, or even things like the Mace factory in Stratford, which had a very different effect on the surrounding communities. Are those all positive things?
I think there are positives. For one thing, the architectural community, I think, is providing a far greater variety of housing types than it did perhaps 20 or 30 years ago. For example, you've now got the return of terraced housing, which can be quite dense in parts of London where it's appropriate for that sort of streetscape. You've also got more prefabricated housing, and it may be that for generational reasons that the idea of prefabs have lost the stigma that was attached to them under some circumstances. So there are things that are being done in boroughs like Newham where prefabrication is being used as part of the package, and it doesn't necessarily mean high-rise towers. This is not the return of Ronan Point. It's a quite different sort of proposition.
And also, just picking up the terraced housing comeback, we are seeing across the Victorian terraces that instead of people moving, they're improving and they're building up, and the good quality stock that has enabled that is really critical for us to learn from. And factory-made housing, we need to make sure that is equally as good stock.
There's a very interesting thing about the way that people talk about the housing market, because most of the discussion, especially at events like MIPIM UK, for understandable reasons, is about activity. In other words, it's about new house building. But actually, of course, the housing market is over 90% of it is just transactional, and it involves houses that are already built. In many cases for the best part of a century, or in some cases a couple of centuries. So I think we have to bear in mind that when people come to choosing where they live, if they have any sort of choice, what do they go for? They tend to go for slightly more generously dimensioned homes, both in terms of space and in terms of volume. That nice ceiling height. They tend to try to go for a garden, and if they can't get a whole garden, then maybe a terrace or a roof terrace these days, or a balcony. And if they're buying old homes, they'll buy them with a view to, well, what can we do with the loft if it hasn't already been done? So there's a huge amount of activity which is trying to create greater amenity for dwellers. And I suppose that the question for people like the GLA and local authorities, and indeed architects and urban designers, is at a time when cities are becoming denser and taller, how do you substitute the private amenity that you might in the old days have got with the house and the generous garden? How do you substitute that amenity in terms of public amenities? So parks, gardens, and the sorts of public space that the Mayor of London and many other mayors have promoted in their cities as a whole.
And moving on to the longer term issues like infrastructure and the many transport projects that are either happening or in the planning or on hold at the minute, what impact is that going to have on London, and what can we do in the short term to improve transport infrastructure?
Well, of course, it's disappointing that Crossrail is delayed and a bit over budget, but I think we have to see that in the context of, it's a 30 or 40 year gestation. Okay, it's a year late. It doesn't alter the fact that it's going to fundamentally, or Elizabeth Line as it's now called, is going to alter people's mental map of London. And I think for me, the implication of that is that it's opening up bits of London to house building activity which wouldn't otherwise have taken place, because people will be able to move about the city at unprecedented speed. I think the message, therefore, is that rather than procrastinate if not prevaricate, as we did over Crossrail 1. We need to get a decision on Crossrail 2 absolutely embedded. And ideally, as Crossrail 1 completes, we should be starting the Crossrail 2 programme, which will take years to roll out. But it does offer the prospect of relieving pressure on the London housing market by making parts of London and some places outside London available for housing, without turning those people into commuters who are at the whim of railway companies. They'll be on Transport for London operated things, which is extremely efficient.
And just thinking about other precedents that we can learn from in terms of transport infrastructure, thinking of the Jubilee line, and what can we learn from how that project was delivered, particularly in terms of its design, that we should be voicing more of in terms of Crossrail and high speed too?
Well, one of the Mayor's policies about good growth is making sure that everything that happens, particularly things that are being publicly funded or essentially public projects, are examples of exemplary design. Now, as far as transport's concerned, the brilliant thing about the Jubilee line, probably the greatest, in aggregate, the greatest piece of civil architecture in London in the whole of the 20th century, a series of magnificent stations. And if you do the surveys about those stations, which station would you rather be in? Would you rather be at Canary Wharf or Westminster or North Greenwich? Or would you rather be in one of those stations they provided on the Victoria line 30 years earlier, where really the only scope the architects had to make it joyful was to fiddle around with tile layouts? So I think the reality is that the public, and after all it's the public that pays for this, like an expression of the best aspirations that the Mayor and Transport for London have for their passengers. Often in quite trying circumstances, lots of congestion. And one of the very few ways that you can express this, because a tunnel is a tunnel is a tunnel, is by making the kind of ambience and the amenity of stations themselves something that make them a pleasure, or in the case of Westminster, rather awe-inspiring.
And last big topic that we might want to discuss, Greenbelt. Anything that we should address there, particularly in terms of what came up with Kingston having a very different landscape to, say, Sutton or Westminster? How do those boroughs with their different areas try and embrace green space in the city?
One of the big problems facing London politicians is how to deal with any suggestion whatsoever that you should ever be able to build on any greenbelt site or its sort of urban equivalent, which is called metropolitan open land. Now, most London, in fact all London boroughs have got metropolitan open land, and some have quite significant amounts of greenbelt. As things stand, there is a general GLA policy, quite understandably, which is absolutely against any nibbling away at what is perceived as kind of lungs for London. However, the reality is that Greenbelt and metropolitan open land, it's not all beautiful countryside, country files, wilderness, wild flowers with cheery cockneys skipping through the grass. There are plenty of bits of Greenbelt and metropolitan open land that are more or less inaccessible to the public, that may only have been designated for historical reasons, are now kind of versions of junk space.
And it's not to say we lose them in their entirety, but there's certainly an improvement process that some of them need to go through.
Well, the point is that if you take a bit of inaccessible scrub land and say, well, you know what, in theory it's metropolitan open land, the reality is it doesn't do anything for any Londoner. But if somebody brings forward a proposal to build on part of that land, then there ought to be an obligation to actually make the open space that's left exemplary of us all and accessible not just to the people who live in the housing, but more generally to the citizens of that borough. And I don't think this is impossible, but this should be done on a site-by-site basis, because you can't have a blanket policy saying you can do it anywhere. Otherwise, you then immediately start losing your school playing fields. But I think it is a problem if policy assumes that all sites are equal when they self-evidently are not.